It's 2023, and for reasons unknown to the car enthusiast community, Subaru no longer makes an STI model. Since the STI sold quite well here in the States, and I was one of those previous generation buyers, it got me wondering, what would the closest replacement be? Enter the 2023 GR Corolla. On paper, it seems to line up, right?
Let's think about this. 300 horsepower from a unique turbocharged engine, all-wheel drive, a hatchback. It really has the formula down. So what we're gonna find out today is A, whether or not the GR Corolla is any good, and then B, will it satisfy the needs of an ex-Subaru STI enthusiast?
And in order to do that, we're gonna be taking a look outside. Inside, I'm going to show you some of the features and technology. We're going to try and throw a bike in the back to see how usable or not it is. And then finally, and most importantly, we're going to take it for a drive to see what it's like out on the road.
Starting first with the exterior, I think this thing is a stunner, completely unique looking vehicle, and I would love to hear what you guys have to think in the comments below. The overall shape, of course, is a bit stubby, and it has a super wide track. It's actually 2.4 inches wider than the regular Corolla hatchback. And I drove the regular Corolla hatchback about 2 years ago in its manual form and really enjoyed it and thought it looked pretty good. This looks even more aggressive and I like it even more. And guess what? It even has some functional aero that some other Toyota products in the performance division can't say. There are some stuck-on bits back here on the door to give it more of a wider look, but overall it looks fantastic, specifically here in supersonic red. I'm not a big red guy personally, but this red absolutely pops on this car. We're seeing it here in the Core model. That is essentially the base model. You have Core, Premium, Circuit, Morizo. You basically forget about the Morizo, you'll never be able to buy one. But this is the base model, and honestly, this is the spec that I would choose. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. This has a performance package, but the only visual differences really between the Core and some of the upper tier models are a slightly bulgier hood with some vents on the upper tiers, and then the Circuit and Morizo gets a carbon fiber roof. But other than that, they're all gonna look pretty much identical. How about wheels and tires? Well, we're working with a square setup, being that this is an all-wheel drive car, so 235 40 18s. I like that they went with 18s and didn't try and fit 19s or 20s on here and give it just a tiny sidewall. So we have a little bit of sidewall to work with. That means hopefully the ride won't be horrible. Of course, we have these blacked out wheels, some 4-piston calipers behind them, and the tires themselves, brand-wise and model, are Michelin Pilot Sport 4s. Under the hood, things start to get pretty interesting here. This is a 1.6 liter turbocharged 3-cylinder engine. That is, of course, the big news. The engine from the GR Yaris is here. So 3-cylinder, highly boosted, makes 300 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque. Will be interesting to see out on the drive how it delivers that power and if there's any lag or anything like that. But small displacement also has a benefit of pretty good fuel economy. 21 miles to the gallon city, 28 highway, which really isn't bad, especially when I look back at STIs that I've owned in the past. I could barely get 20 miles to the gallon. So probably not your #1 selling point, but pretty beneficial, especially considering this is all-wheel drive. And speaking of all-wheel drive, this is the Core model, but it does have one crucial option. That is the performance package, which gives you Torsen limited slip differentials, which to me is a must. Popping inside the GR Corolla, well, it's very similar to a regular Corolla, but that's not all bad. A very simple design here, functional, we'll put it that way. You have physical buttons for the important things. You guys hear me harp about this all the time. HVAC controls, volume knobs, all that stuff is physical. You get this center screen, which is very quick to respond, has Apple CarPlay, Android Auto. What else do you want? It works well. Totally good with that. Steering wheel, cool size and shape. I like it. It has a million buttons on it, maybe too many for me, but it is functional And this thing is also packed with a lot of features, things like that come standard. Things like adaptive cruise control, lane centering. If you're about to run somebody over, it will let you know. Toyota's packing a lot of these safety features standard with their cars, and it's nice to know that even though this is based on a cheap car, that this car has them. It also has an all-digital gauge cluster, which can be a little bit busy at times. You can change the menus a bunch, and it gives you a million notifications. But when you're driving, tachometer's front and center, speed is front and center. It's easy to read, totally works. I like it. I don't love the seats. They're a bit of a letdown for me. This is the base option. I would like to sit in the upper tier ones, although I think they are more or less the same, just a different material. This is cloth, which is totally fine by me. But my base complaint personally is there's no lumbar support. I have a shitty back. No lumbar support sucks for me. But there is a little bit of support here. There's quite a lot of movement otherwise though. So for track driving, you might consider getting some real seats. I don't know how well these are going to hold you in. A positive though on the seating front is I can sit behind myself at 6'1" in the back seat. And I actually have headroom, which is a huge surprise for a car this size. And I have just enough knee room. It's not super luxurious and I'm not swimming around back there, but the fact that I have headroom is pretty critical. It is actually a quite usable car. And once again, all these things kind of bring me back to an STI, right? It's functional. You have your drive mode select here, adjusting your front and rear bias, very STI-like, a usable hatch, somewhat STI-like, depending on what generation you're talking about. So let's try and cram a bike in the back of here and then take this thing on the road.
Now, typically with the bike test, I try and first fit my 29er mountain bike, but with this hatch opening being relatively small, it was apparent there was zero chance of that happening, specifically with the wheel on. Instead, I went straight to my hybrid road bike, which just barely will not fit with the front wheel on. Of course, once you take off the front wheel, it fits relatively easily. Once again, proving that a hatch is the way to go. And as always, if you enjoyed the bike test, make sure you're hitting the subscribe and like button down below so you don't miss future videos.
In 2023, if a sports car is going to impress me, it has to be more than fast. Everything is fast these days, right? Everything has a stupid quick 0 to 60 in lap time. So I'm personally looking for much more than speed from a sports car. And that's a tough thing, right? Because it's sort of hard to quantify that. Objective things like 0 to 60s, lap times are very easy to quantify. But how do you describe what something feels like to drive? Well, that's what we're gonna try and do today, because this GR Corolla is a very special car and it has that it factor that you really want in a special product, in the sense that it does more than just go fast. And really it all starts first with this engine. I think I had strange expectations going into this review because I was very leery if this car would live up to the hype. There's so many people talking so highly about it. When I got it, I'm like, there's no way it's living up to these expectations, right? A 3-cylinder, like how good can a 3-cylinder be? Well, it turns out actually quite good. And outside of just the performance figures, which are really good for this thing, it has an interesting theater to it. I mean, this is a 3-cylinder that revs to 7 and keeps pulling. It doesn't just fall on its face torque-wise, down low. But what's interesting is it actually growls at you. It provides really interesting tonal qualities, some vibrations and graveliness, but in a good way. And a lot of engines, if they're kind of gravelly, that's a bad thing. But this kind of has this very like desirable growl to it. So that's really been a huge surprise for me. And also, I don't know if you can hear this, turbo noises. There are a lot of turbo noises coming from this engine, specifically bypass valve noise. So when you load it up and get the boost going and then you let off, you just get that. It's kind of old school in that regard. So I never really thought that a 3-cylinder engine powered car would be this fun, but it really is. That's really the basis for this formula. Now, the rest of the car, and it sounds a bit cliche to say, but what I enjoy about it is that it feels mechanical. It feels sort of old school. So when you're driving it, and of course the manual transmission helps with that, but when you're shifting, you can feel and hear the clutch, you can feel and hear the diff in the back. These are just kind of old school qualities where a lot of modern car companies are isolating these things out of a driving experience, even in a sports car. You know, they have like rubber bushings or fluid-filled bushings. This car, you kind of feel all that stuff. Now, that's not to say that the steering wheel has the most feedback ever. I could feel a little bit as to what's going on. It's not like a total pure old school experience, but the rest of the chassis is very communicative, and that's what I really like about it. The transmission, short gear ratios, so that's really fun to row the gears. And the shifter itself is pretty good. Toyota tends to do a pretty good shifter. And what's interesting about that is that it is cable operated, but even though it's cable operated, still quite good. In fact, I would say it's a little bit better than the WRX that I drove not too long ago. Now, the rest of the car, let's talk suspension. There is a bit of lean in this car, especially when you sort of enter a corner. It sort of rolls over a little bit, and because of that, it tends to understeer on corner entry. But once it loads up, it handles pretty neutrally. And then additionally, if you put your foot into it, like you actually apply some power, it seems to help rotate the vehicle. It doesn't drift by any means, but it will help rotate and set the car. So sort of interesting dynamics. And the suspension, once again, slightly softer. I mean, it's a firmer ride, but slightly on the softer side from a body motion perspective. But what I will say is that there is a bit of harshness to it in perception, because it seems like there's not a ton of suspension travel. So when you go over bumps, it seems to bottom out and hit the bump stops quite often. So it's sort of a mixed bag. In some ways, it feels compliant. In some ways, it feels harsh, just because of that lack of suspension travel. But certainly very much livable on a day-to-day basis. What I will say, though, is, of course, part of this video is comparing this to kind of outgoing STIs or WRXs. Subaru does the suspension thing better than this car, 100%. The ride in the WRX that I drove was better, just pretty much all around. But not to say that this is a poor handling car by any means. We talked about the dynamics, and of course the grip levels are immense. And that's where things start to feel, very familiar if you come from an STI. And one of the things that you like driving an STI is that sort of comfort that it's always going to be there for you. The car's stable, it's not going to spin out, stuff like that. Now, what's interesting about this car, when you start to look at from a value perspective, comparing it to something like a WRX, you can get a WRX premium for about 33, 34 grand. This starts at 36. You throw the $1,000 performance package on, which you're going to want to do. So it's certainly a little more, but pretty comparably equipped. This is going to have some more things, once again, along the lines of the premium. It's going to have the sort of push button start, the keyless entry, those kinds of things like the premium, but it won't have things like heated seats at the same price point. So that's a bit of a bummer. But overall, this has some nice features that are better for a daily driver. And I think that's what most people are using this for, right? It's an all-around car. So what you get is things like adaptive cruise control, lane centering. These are super nice to have in a daily driven car, and things that Subaru doesn't even offer on their manual transmission cars. You have to opt for their automatics, their performance transmission, aka CVT transmissions, to be able to get eyesight, which will give you those features. They all come standard on here, so that's really nice. So from a feature set perspective, it's pretty good. This car is a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun. It puts a smile on your face. Now, what are the cons? Really, we've mostly talked about high points so far, and frankly, there aren't a ton of cons. So my cons are a bit of nitpicks, things that are not deal breakers by any means, but things you should know about. First of all, it is based on a cheap car platform. This is based on a Corolla. So I noticed some rattles. I noticed a dash rattle. There's a rattle in this passenger side door, which is kind of annoying sometimes. These are things you can't really escape, with a Corolla, right? No matter how much they church it up, it's still a Corolla underneath. Overall, pretty solid, but just not as solid or as screwed together as Subarus are. When I drove that WRX, really no rattles at all. It was a very, very solid feeling car. So that's something that you miss out here. You also miss out on a armrest, which is a very odd choice that they would remove the armrest in this car. I'm sure you could probably retrofit one, so that's not, once again, the end of the world, but just sort of an odd decision. And we already talked about the slightly compromised ride. Compromise is the wrong term, but I think, once again, Subaru makes a better riding vehicle than this. So in the end, I guess we set out to ask two things, right? One was, in a vacuum, is this a good car? Like, compared to nothing else, just, is this a good car? Absolutely. It offers a fun factor that a lot of cars are missing. It offers performance. So it kind of has both of those things. And it's very practical. So it's really this like all year round usable vehicle. Now, what about how it compares to an STI or someone who has previously owned an STI? Like, would this car satisfy them? And the answer is most definitely yes. It's just that those intangibles that people liked about STIs that are also present here. STIs had that rumbly, sort of rough and gruff engine that had a lot of character. This has that. It doesn't rumble, it growls, and it makes great turbo noises, but it still accomplishes the same thing, right? It makes you smile, it gives you enjoyment. Of course, all-wheel drive, 300 horsepower, very sure-footed. It never puts you in a space of being uncomfortable with pushing the limits. It's a very safe car to drive. And then, of course, with the hatch, some people are all about the hatch with WRXs and STIs. Well, now you can get them with the GR Corolla. So overall, fantastic little package. I am very impressed by this. Like I said, expectations were very high, and it still met or exceeded those expectations. I've really enjoyed driving this. Anyone who can get their hands on one of these core models with the, mid to upper 30s $1,000 price range, that's where money is well spent. I would not recommend getting into the Circuit, the Morizo, which are $40,000, $50,000 if you can even find one, because the value proposition starts to not make as much sense. And ultimately, the Morizo, well, not the Morizo is different, but the Circuit is fundamentally the same car as this. So that's one of the things that you need to keep in mind when you're shopping for these. So hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.